U.S.-Africa relations, an opportunity lost or found. This is the title of an article I read on the webpage of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in one of its series, A Nation Must Think Before It Acts. Now, this article talks about the relationship that exists between the U.S. and by extension the West and Africa, and who stands to benefit from that relationship. In this article, the author interestingly concluded that Africa should be seen less as a problem and more as an opportunity. But the question is, an opportunity to who? Today, my guest on Spotlight is Dr. Tom Gordon Palmer. Now, although this does not represent the entire view of the U.S. as a country, to what extent does this play out in West perceived notions about Africa? And where does Africa stand when we are talking about the West's influence on the continent? Tonight, my guest is a German-born American-lived libertarian. He is the vice president for the international programs at the Atlas Network and also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. We'll be right back after this break, and I'll introduce him. Adwoa Tenkoramaa Domina, and you're welcome to Spotlight on MX24 television. Tom Gordon Palmer, like I said earlier, is my guest today. He has a huge, inexhaustible portfolio, but I'll attempt to mention just a few. Like I said before the break, two of his most known positions is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and vice president at Atlas Network in charge of international program. But he is also an author with many books to his credit, including The Morality of Capitalism. I think I've read excerpts of that. After the Welfare State and many others. Now, he is also a former vice president of the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. He has a lot of articles to his credit worldwide. Tom, welcome. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to be with you.
Spotlight. First of all, the West, of which you were born in Germany. A lot of times Africans say that the West has exploited the continent for so long. Would you see this as a victim mentality of Africa that we need to grow out of?
I think we need to be honest about the past and then honest about the present and the future. In the past, the exploitation was brutal and terrible. It varied across the continent. Some of the most horrifying cases in Zaire, for example, where about 50% of the population died in a short period of time, in the Belgian Congo, to other less brutal forms in other parts of the continent. But there was stealing. It was stealing. Let's just be frank about that. It was piracy. You come, you show up to someone else's country, you say, oh, we're going to take this land, and so on.
So you stole from us, essentially?
Well, I was not involved in the process.
Your people stole from us.
Well, the people also who opposed it. Adam Smith said it was a system of folly and injustice. He said this was shameful because it was unjust to go steal from people who didn't do anything to hurt you. Why do that? It was also foolish, and here's where you come to the economics of it. And that is, huge amounts of harm were done, but to the benefit of whom? To the benefit of the arms manufacturers, the ship manufacturers, the people involved, but not the bulk of the British population. They paid the taxes. Their sons were taken to die in the wars. It was to the benefit of a kleptocratic class of people.
Would you say that that was a time for survival of the fittest, and the West took advantage of whatever they could get, and Africa unfortunately could not do that?
In some ways, it was the group that discovered gunpowder and long-distance sailing first that ended up committing these harmful acts to other people. They were not the only ones. The Arabs were also colonizing Africa and engaged in brutal slave trade practices across the continent, the Turks and others as well. So they were not unique in this, but Africans were victimized by this to a very, very great extent. And then when they finally decolonized, when they finally left and took their armies out, they left behind colonial states that were highly predatory. Where the borders had been drawn up in Berlin, these are not indigenous African borders, they divided entire nations of people from their co-nationals and their cousins, set up barbed wire and barriers between people. And one of the legacies of this is that Africa has the least free trade of any continent in the world. It's easier to do business in many cases if you're in an African country with people in Japan or England or France or America than the people next door in Cote d'Ivoire or Benin or Nigeria. At this point, African leaders have inherited this system. They need to really decolonize by getting rid of those restrictions.
To what extent do you think we have come from that perspective of being exploited to actually taking charge of the continent's destiny moving forward?
Well, I'll be a little bit controversial here. I think in some cases, and it varies by country, the post-colonial leaders just moved into the chairs of the colonists and continued the process, looting for their own benefits and that of their families. That's really the shame. Authentic decolonization means getting rid of those colonial structures. One of the worst European exports was bureaucracy. Paperwork, permission, paper, file all of these papers. And that is un-African. It has no background in African customs or practices. Africans traded freely across the continent without asking for customs duties and papers and forms and certificates and so on. And authentic decolonization means getting rid of that ugly residue of colonialism and instituting trade. And that's why I'm very enthusiastic about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. I think it's important, but I wish that there would be much more urgency to it. Under the current timeline, our grandchildren might live to see it. It's so slow. And I think people should demand faster, the ability to trade with Africans and other countries that is denied now, not by European colonialists, but by African governments.
So I wanted to ask on the questions on the free trade area much later, but now that you have brought it, what do you think we should do differently to speed up the process? You've mentioned that it's quite a bit slow. And then it might expand into the near future. But really, what can we do in the interim to speed the process up?
But there are several things. One is within countries, many of these trade barriers can be eliminated unilaterally.
Like what?
All of the restrictions on importing goods from other countries. The customs barriers are so onerous in Africa. And I think people who have experienced driving across Africa have experienced that. The border checkpoints, the long delays, and those things can be reduced and even eliminated. In the Schengen zone within the European Union, you can drive all the way from Poland to Spain and never get stopped at a border point, never have a gun pointed at you, never be asked for documents or what you're carrying. And I think that is a better direction for Africa to take as well.
Where do you think Africa stands now when it comes to the world economic structure?
I think it's on a kind of a precipice, but all the decisions that matter are not going to be taken in Washington or London or Paris. They're going to be taken in African capitals. Africa can become a real powerhouse. It has a growing and youthful population, which is a huge reservoir of ability and talent. That is often underestimated. People think that wealth is gold in the ground. It's not. Wealth is fundamentally the ability of people to create wealth. Give you a simple example. Two of the richest countries in the world, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, they don't have any natural resources. No gold, no diamonds. They don't have those things. Not even land. The Dutch have to make land out of the ocean. What they had was people who were free to experiment. In effect, they liberated their informal sector. And as Professor George Ayite, we're here to memorialize him at University of Ghana, lecture and other universities here, he pointed out that the informal sector in Africa will be the source of tremendous opportunity, tremendous growth, if they are not harassed by government.
Right.
As an example, Henry Ford, as he points out, he didn't start with a big corporation, a big board of directors, a lot of fancy names on it. He started in a stable, tinkering with machines, and ended up creating the assembly line to make the Model T car, which is a car that could be afforded not by the rich and powerful, but by any working person. Apple Computer starts in a garage, not with some big government grant, but some young people tinkering with some electronics boards in a garage.
Doc, how long have you been in Accra?
Sorry?
How long have you been in Accra
On
this
this
particular trip?
Only 4 days, but I've been here maybe 5 times in the past and dealt with programs at universities and met a lot of business people.
So talking about entrepreneurship, if you were in Ghana, if you were a Ghanaian, what job would have been your go-to choice to build wealth in the country?
That's an interesting question. Well, I think there's tremendous opportunity in agricultural sector. Palm oil, the industry really could be rationalized. There's a fortune to be made for people who can figure out how to improve the efficiency of the palm oil production system so that you end up exporting refined products out of the country. So agriculture is often overlooked, but it's a source of great wealth. So that would be my first one. And indeed, I'll mention one thing. A lot of thinking about economic development is distorted by thinking what has to be like big factories, like in Germany and someplace. New Zealand, what are their primary exports? 35% is made up of honey and dairy products, right? It's agriculture primarily, fruit, nuts, honey, dairy products, fruit juices, and so on. Those are the overwhelming bulk of their exports. It's a rich country. There's nothing shameful about agricultural exporting, but you need to have the freedom for the farmers and the freedom for the middleman to be able to export it and make money from it. The other area, I think, is IT. And what we saw in India, against the government's wishes, people set up call centers and other programs. They did all kinds of computer maintenance abroad. And that sector grew so fast and raised 350 million people out of poverty. It's really quite astonishing what happened in India after 1991. So I think IT is another area that Africa, and Ghana in particular, could excel at.
So 2 main areas, agriculture and IT. In Ghana, we have the government has a program called the Planting for Food and Jobs. I think it was rolled out in 2019, and it has come very far, 2017 rather, when the government started its first term. So it's been about 6 years now. And essentially is to boost the agricultural sector and give fertilizers, help farmers improve their knowledge on agriculture, and invite private sector participation in the sector. How can we maximize this concept to ensure that we develop around the theme of agriculture?
Well, I think actually the first one, and many African governments have failed in this area, Ghana has a middling position, is to maintain the security of property of the farmers. So property systems that are well developed so people know clearly what's my land, what's your land. It doesn't mean importing some European system or a cadastral map system from abroad. It means respecting customary law. But customary law can be formalized and can be modernized, if you will, through technologies such as GPS and blockchain and so on, so that you end up with a much more efficient land market. That's one of the keys. Having efficient property rights, respect for the farmers, and then, this is the hardest thing for politicians to do, leave them alone. They know farming better than people do in Accra.
Right.
They know farming better than I know. And the idea, this went back to the so-called Peace Corps of the United States. Kids who grew up in Manhattan and New York City are going to come teach Ghanaians how to farm. It's an absurdity. Ghanaians know how to farm. They live on the land. They understand it. Let them farm. Let them innovate and figure out new crops, new techniques, but learn to respect their rights, and then for politicians to keep their hands to themselves.
I think for a long time now, the challenge has been that most Ghanaian farmers have focused on smallholder, subsistence farming, not really do farming on a large scale, something that can result in exporting your products outside. How do we change that?
Well, again, it's not because of a preference in most cases. Most people, if you ask, do you prefer to be poor or wealthy? We know how they're going to answer.
Of course.
And subsistence farming is subsistence. You grow what you eat and just barely enough to have any other products. It means allowing them, for instance, to consolidate their land. Some people are not such good farmers. Let other farmers buy them out. They can get jobs in the city. That's fine.
So private partnership.
Private partnership, allowing people to create co-ops with much larger expanses of land. You can end up with a more intensive kind of farming methodology, irrigation, and so on. But again, those are things that we leave to the farmers. And politicians generally don't know farming. So it's just like with anything else. When I have a legal question, I ask a lawyer. When I have a medical question, I ask a doctor. But then people say, oh, I have a farming question. It never occurs to them to ask a farmer. But farmers are the ones who know. Let them have the freedom to create those agricultural businesses. There wasn't a government policy in wealthy countries that said, you have to farm this way or that way. They let farmers work that out.
You seem to have a thought line of capitalism. Is that what informs your economic understanding of your appreciation or your appreciation of the world economy?
No, but in a word, it's because the word capitalism was invented by someone who hated the system he was described it. It's invented by Marx and the Marxists. And it's a misunderstanding of what markets are about. It's not about capital. It's not about even savings, although capital and savings are important. It's about innovation. The better term is innovism. It hasn't taken off, unfortunately. But innovism, that's where you see real gains in living standards. First, economic development isn't just building big factories. That's what the communists thought, and they destroyed their countries with pollution and catastrophe. Building factories is not what makes you wealthy. It's
really?
Innovating. So I mentioned New Zealand. That's not primarily manufacturing. Machinery exports are only about 2% of their total exports. They're actually primarily exporting what we call primary goods, wood, nuts, fruit.
Well, some economists might disagree with you because most people say that now manufacturing is the go-to idea if you want to develop your economy. Because if you're only exporting or if you're only producing on a small scale and you don't have the factories to boost the production that will enable you export, then really what are you doing as a country?
The evidence shows that they're wrong.
Really?
The evidence shows that they're simply wrong. So factories may add value. I'm not anti-factory by any means. The question is adding value. That's what we want to do. And 100 cedis worth of palm oil or 100 cedis worth of automobile parts, it's 100 cedis worth, right? And if you export 100 cedis worth, you have 100 cedis worth of value to buy other things. That's where it should be taking place. It's about adding value, and that is about innovation.
So for a country like Ghana, which shuffles between capitalism and socialism, because I say this because some governments will come and their ideals are mostly capitalist. Others will come and they believe in building systems where the people can get free access to a lot of things, education, health. So in Ghana, for instance, we have a government that says allow private sector to thrive. But then again, we'll let every child of school-going age in the secondary school attend school for free. With that kind of system, where do you strike the balance between a government that wants to provide for its people, at the same time wants to expand on capitalism?
That's a deep and important question. The first point, if there's going to be redistribution, something has to be created to be redistributed. So that's what often the socialists didn't understand. They were trying to redistribute a shrinking pie. You want the pie to grow more for everybody. Second thing is then if the government says, okay, we're going to finance education, it doesn't mean they have to provide it. And there are lots of private schools that do a much better job than the government schools. They're thriving all across Africa. and all across India and other countries as well. In many cases, more children are enrolled in private schools than the free government schools, because in the private school, if they don't get the business of the parents, they don't get any money. So they actually teach the children. In the government schools, often the teachers are drunk or absent, and the consequences, no teaching. So if the government finances it through a voucher system, for example, everyone gets a voucher, but then you can pick the school you want to take it to. Sweden has that system. It works very, very well.
But when you say a voucher system, what exactly does it entail?
It means that if you have one child or two children, you get one voucher or two vouchers equivalent to so much money, right? So then if the school accepts...
So you decide a school you want to take your work to.
That's right. The money follows the student, basically. And so the parents with the student decide it's this school or that school, this one is better for us, it reflects our religious values perhaps, or our interest in STEM or music or science or something else. That's where the child is going to go. Then they take the voucher and the school can cash that in from the government for the money.
So free education, especially at the senior high school level, is not something you encourage governments to do?
Well, again, if they're going
completely free.
If they're going to do it free, it means you get a voucher. But I don't think they should have a monopoly on the provision. So the financing and the provision are two different matters. And that's a social choice. Are we going to offer everyone a voucher? Okay, you can do that. But don't monopolize the provision. Monopolies systematically deliver bad results in everything. You want competition. No reason not to have competition in medical care, dental care, education, and other things. So you might finance the provision, say, here's the base. Everyone is entitled to this basic education or medical care, whatever it is, but don't monopolize the provision. That's where markets do such a good job of driving improvement and better customer service.
So I believe competition comes in when there are a lot of options. And when the private sector is involved. But here, in this case, it's usually public-centered. So the schools are public schools that you attend. And for people have made the arguments that for a country that has run to the IMF a couple of times, we have gone back again, perhaps free SHS is not something that we should still keep as a policy.
You mean the free education?
Yes.
Let me put it this way. It's a budgetary question. Are there the resources to finance it? So that's a question for Ghanaians to make those trade-offs. What do we want to pay for? What are we going to get? Where I think the evidence is strong is however you finance it, have the provision be competitive, with government schools and private schools all competing to get those vouchers from parents, which means if I'm a school headmaster, we have to be doing a better job to get those vouchers coming into our school rather than your school. I want to make sure our students do better, they perform better on exams, they're better educated. I have an incentive to do that. But if instead the students are allocated to the school by the government because I have some monopoly, well, my incentive to improve the quality of education is diminished.
What do you do when you're not reading or writing as a person? Because I know you do a lot of writing and you do reading as well.
That's mostly what I do.
But apart from that, you like traveling?
I do. Unfortunately, the needs of my job are so pressing. I travel for business most of the time. And that means meeting wonderful people. I'm not complaining. I get to meet awesome people at universities, university students, professors, writers, journalists, and so on. But I don't spend much of my time looking at monuments and valleys and waterfalls like other people do when they travel. I like to go and travel and share experiences with interesting people.
So do you have any hobbies apart from writing, reading, traveling?
I love skiing, but I never have time to do it. And skiing in Thailand isn't very good because it's a hot tropical country.
Do you know how to sing?
I cannot sing to save my life.
Dance?
The same here. If I were to dance, it would humiliate me beyond belief.
I'd want to see that one day. So apart from reading, you seem too much of a serious person. Is there something light you do to, live life?
I do enjoy reading poetry and novels, but that's what I do on airplanes when I'm traveling from one university lecture to another.
Yes, again, when you're traveling. Right. So let me ask you one question, perhaps, before we go back to break. We were talking about exports a lot in our earlier conversation. And for Africa, a lot of our foreign direct investments have really come from exports of our raw materials. And people have the notion that this is because the continent for so long have been seen as a producer of raw materials and nothing more. So the West would only come and take the raw materials, or we would willingly give up our raw materials and they would develop into finished products and then bring it back, we buy them back at higher cost. What can we do to change this narrative?
Well, it's an interesting question. And I think that the export of raw materials for much of Africa has not been that beneficial because it gets sucked off by the top elite in government and so on. But there are some successful cases. The first point is it's kind of a puzzling view. People say we should keep this, let's say oil. What are you going to do with a bunch of oil? So we get the oil out of the ground, now we keep it, and then what? The point of pulling oil out of the ground is to sell it to people and use the money to buy other things. Unfortunately, Nigeria is a good case. The state and the top elites have looted it. The benefits have not gone to the vast bulk of the people. It's been stolen by the domestic political class. Now, Botswana is a very interesting counterexample on the African continent. They export diamonds. There's 94% of Botswana's exports are diamonds. What would you do with diamonds if you said, oh, we'll keep them all here? This is pointless. The point of taking the diamonds out of the ground is to sell them. And Botswana has done a very good job because they have good local governance. They don't have an army that leads coups and military takeovers. I think this ended up being good for them. And they have a stable rule of law in the country. And the consequence is much more rapid economic growth, which means actual increases in living standards for Botswanans than virtually any other economy in Africa. So sometimes you'll see official statistics that show high rate of growth, particularly in an oil-based economy. But that's all sectioned off by the ruling elite. Right. Almost none of it goes down to the average people. Botswana's is quite different. Real increases in living standards of the population. And it has to do very much with the governance systems in Botswana. That they are then able to make the diamond industry so beneficial to their population. And I think a similar thing can be done in Ghana with the gold industry, for example. Again, the point of digging out the gold is to sell it to someone. You can't eat the gold, right? Right. But to do so in a way with better mining laws, more transparency, and that means fewer deals where the politicians are the ones who get to take some of it for themselves.
So a typical example of the raw materials perhaps I wanted to mention was cocoa. So Ghana is known worldwide as a huge exporter of cocoa. Yes. But the problem usually is that we export it in its raw state. The beans, we dry them and we bag them and that's it. Instead of perhaps producing them. Now people are doing it, doing chocolates, doing coffee, other things out of it. But really, how do we maximize that the cocoa industry in the country to ensure that we tap into this very, very, very huge global market?
With two things that are important here. The cocoa industry has suffered from bad governance policies from the Ghanaian government, which going over a long period of time actually attacking cocoa farmers, uprooting their trees and so on. Cocoa industry is actually a remarkably long-term oriented industry. It's over a decade before a cocoa plant is producing the material you want, which means that's an industry you really have to make long-term plans. It's not some short-term agricultural product. We grow carrots and sell them. It requires a business mentality. And Ghanaians, early on, let's go back into the early years of the last century, had astonishingly remarkable successes that led to introduction by local business people, Ghanaian business people, not British, not foreigners, They built the first quality road systems in the country, were built with their own money and their own capital. Well, Polly Hill, a very fine development economist, documented this in her work on Ghanaian economic history. Then the question is, well, what about the additional levels of production? You can add additional value, but it means having a labor force that's free to work for you and having the freedom to set up the processing plant without all of the restrictions and controls that typically are demanded by the government. So I think the Ghanaian cocoa industry, you're quite right, it's a world leader. It can be more successful, but it means you have to have that entrepreneurial freedom. And I can guarantee one thing, government programs to set up cocoa processing are not successful. Again, why? Politicians don't understand the cocoa industry. Cocoa farmers do.
We'll go for a quick break here. My guest is Dr. Tom Palmer, and you're watching Spotlight. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're still watching Spotlight right here on MX24 television. Before we went for the break, I was talking to Dr. Tom Gordon Palmer, but right now we have another guest joining us in studio. His name is Olumayowa Okediran. I hope I got that name
yes,
right. So he is the Global Director of Programs at Studies for Liberty.
Students for Liberty.
Students for Liberty. What do you do at Students for Liberty?
Thank you. So Students for Liberty is a global nonprofit. We work with students in about 110 countries. Students who are interested in promoting the ideas of liberty, who look at their societies and want change in their societies, and think that they are going to be the agents of that change. So we work with them to identify ways by which they can make their societies better. We provide the resources and training for them to do that.
For some reason, I find a lot of African youth link the need to cause change in their society to migration and coming back. So they would want to go outside, go and get more expertise, go and get a broader sense of the world, and then come back. What's your thoughts on Africans, especially the youth, migrating from where they are to other countries?
I think it's okay for people to want to learn a different system or go to a different society to learn how things are done there. But I would disagree that that's the majority of what young Africans are doing. If you go to Lagos or you go to Nairobi, you see a lot of tech startups. You see a lot of fintechs. You see a lot of people staying in the country, sort of building products and providing services. And that's very inspiring. However, there are people who want to go study, learn, like get a different degree and come back to the country. There are different routes to changing your society. There are different ways to go about it. And I think that a lot of young people are understanding that and are putting effort into changing their societies in their own way.
But we do have a lot of young Nigerians, at least from the narratives we've seen, wanting to relocate.
Yes.
You call it Japa,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
And there seems to be a craze around it. Everybody wants to, I believe, to escape the poverty tag on Africa. So they are running away to developed countries. Is that not something that exists in Nigeria? Yes.
So that's a current phenomenon. Nigeria right now sees a lot more young people leave the shores of the country with plans to live in better societies that they consider to be better because of the current situation of things. But you find that a lot of them have plans to come back home. They want to come back and set up businesses or start something new. What we're seeing is a situation of things. This current situation of things as a result of the way the government has mismanaged the country.
You mean African governments or Nigerian government?
Nigerian government right now, right? You see a lot of these things happen across the continent, but specifically with respect to Nigeria, this is as a result of how the government has managed things. Young people, especially after the NSAS protest, which was a situation where young people came out, they thought they were going to see change happen, and they strived for that change, but eventually,
it did not happen.
Did not happen. So that has made a lot of young people sort of tired of the status quo. But when I speak to many of them, the goal is not to live abroad for the rest of their lives. The goal is to go there for a couple of years, get that experience and hopefully try to make change happen from there.
So it comes back essentially to the point I was making, that people is like a cycle. So I live here, I want to move to the UK, get a better sense of life or develop myself, then come back home. That's what is pertaining in the African culture or their system.
So that's happening. But there are still stories of people who are staying, who are starting businesses. Like we have Flutterwave, the people who build Flutterwave, for example, this payment system that everyone is using across the continent of Africa, they're in the country. If you go to Nairobi as well, you see a lot of hubs, tech startup hubs, people learning like product design or product management or project management, and are also staying in the country. So there are people who want to make that change from living a different society and potentially coming back. And there are a lot of young people who are actually staying. It's sort of a mixed bag of different people approaching this from different perspectives.
I'll bring Dr. Gordon in right now, but you live in the UK now.
Yes, I moved to the UK a couple of months ago.
What took you there?
My wife got a job in the UK, and I've been in the UK, yes, I have to move there.
So you are a typical example of a Nigerian who has lived most life in the country,
Yes.
but now has to relocate because perhaps wife got a better job opportunity, so you have to move to her. Is that not, in a way, moving the continent's brain to another country?
So the way I see it now is that the world is a global village, right? Even when I lived in Nigeria, I spent most of my time not also in the country. I spent many months in Kenya, many months in South Africa, in the US. And I feel like when you move outside of the country, you learn different things. You learn how things are done in different societies. And when you come back to the country, it sort of changes things there. I'm going back to Nigeria tomorrow, and I'm going to be in Nigeria. I'm going to continue to go back to Nigeria to sort of make change happen there. So the narrative that when people leave, that they're living permanently, is what I think is wrong. Because when I speak to many people my age who live outside of the country, every 3 months they're back in Nigeria. They have like a business going on there. Some people are running like Airbnbs, or they are, there's like a new business they're starting up in their village. So it's not that they entirely abandon the country, right? They don't abandon the country. They leave the country. They get access to capital or to finances, and then they go back to the country and continue to develop the country. That's the pattern that I've seen.
Look, he mentioned that the world is a global village. How, what's the part of Africa in that village? Does Africa even contribute, even remotely, to the world setting of a village?
It's a deep question. I think the answer is yes. I mean, let's think about just a few things that might seem superficial but touch us nonetheless. Music. African music is everywhere in the world. Jazz music is African music, but then also the wonderful music comes out of Senegal, South Africa, so many parts of Africa, and now they're very much global. So that's part of Global Village, is music and culture. But then there are also the abilities of people to use their talents. So one of the questions that comes up is, in this question, why do people leave Africa? Well, it's because they see more opportunity abroad. But they are taking their skills to other countries. That is enriching the globe. And let me mention something about...
That is enriching those countries.
It's enriching the countries from which they came as well. Remittances are massive. Remittances dwarf so-called foreign aid, which I think is largely negative in the world. Foreign aid is a huge source of corruption across the world, and especially Africa, I'm sad to say. Remittances are different. That's when you send your mom money because you have a job working in Germany or Canada or Australia or France or wherever. You send mama, that money is sent to her, and that goes to educate the younger children in the family. It goes to improve the family house. It goes to buy livestock or chickens or fertilizer or build a small business. And in addition, people who go and save. I'll give you an example from Europe, not from Africa. Poland was so poor for so long. When they came out of communism, it was so impoverished that medical doctors would go to work in Germany as house cleaners and earn more money but they would save that money from working in these very menial jobs. And I'm talking about highly educated medical doctors will go work as dishwashers in Germany, save money, and come back and start a clinic. And they did enrich the country. So if people are able to freely come and go, and if remittances can be sent cheaply, and now they can with things like WISE and all these other payment systems, this so-called brain drain is really establishing places and people where their incomes go up dramatically, and they send a very substantial part of that back home. So we should not denigrate that or think that it's only exporting brains and knowledge, because they are bringing back the money that they're earning. They're being paid a higher wage outside and enriching in their country.
So, Doc, I want to go back to the issue of governance system or economic systems. In one of the lectures you delivered, I think about 10 years ago, I watched it on YouTube, and you delivered it at the Institute of Public Affairs in Australia. And in the lecture, if my producer will just put that picture slide on the screen for us to see. So you said that you want to make hard choices, and you're talking to states. You want to make hard choices and cut back on unaffordable expenditure. This has to be done. You will be painted as heartless and cruel, but you know what? You're taking charge of the society and the future. Do you still hold this view?
Yes. I think too many governments overpromise and underdeliver. But in the process, they bankrupt themselves. They bankrupt the government, and sadly, they bankrupt the population. Because it's easy when I'm running for office to say, I'll promise you all these benefits. You'll get fabulous benefits when you're retired or older or what have you. Doesn't cost anything right now. It's just a promise to pay. And then 20 years later, you have to pay those benefits, but they're not the resources. So those unfunded liabilities accumulate and get bigger and bigger and bigger, and governments fundamentally will fall because of them. And that means Australia was an interesting case. They faced that crisis and they said, whoa, 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 let's be careful about this. Let's think like mom does when she does the family budget. She says, what are the obligations and what are the assets? And then you have to balance those. Politicians systematically fail to do that in so many countries because they know, I won't be in office in 30 years, so what do I care? And they overpromise, but the consequence is bankruptcy. So it means, as the Australians did, the Swedes did, a number of other countries, they hit a wall. Their governments had overpromised, and then they sat down and had a rational conversation around the dinner table like mom and dad do when they drop the family budget. And they said, okay, we can't afford that. Let's see what we can afford. And I think that is really a foundation for good governance.
What role does corruption play in challenging good governance systems?
It certainly makes it more difficult, but here's the question. Where do we put the blame? How do you address it? And quite often, the politician is presented as some innocent, pure virgin who's being corrupted by the outside force, when in fact, the politicians often go and extort the money from entrepreneurs, from farmers, from people who need to get access to government permissions, driver's license, whatever. And what we need to do is address that question of how do they have the power to extort? So here's a very simple reform. It doesn't sound so brilliant. It's simple. Registration processes, register your car, all those things, do all that online. It turns out the app doesn't shake you down for a bribe.
Paperless.
Right? It's paperless. Do it online. And countries that have moved to that way see a serious reduction in this kind of petty corruption that just makes life miserable when you have to pay them off and wait in a queue and so on. That's one way to deal with it. Another way then is to have much more transparency. And here's an area where I know it's not perfect, but Ghana has outshone most of the continent by having a free media that can speak truth to power and unveil abuse of public funds and so on. So the free media is absolutely essential to that procedure. And then having an independent judiciary that's not afraid, if a politician is brought before them and accused of corruption, is not afraid to apply the law the same way that it would be applied to you or me. And those elements help to reduce corruption. You'll never make it zero. In Switzerland, there's some corrupt official someplace, I'm sure. It's just very low relative to most countries. And the question is, how do you reduce it? Because corruption is a drag on the productivity and just the dignity also of everybody else.
Would you classify cronyism as part of corruption?
Absolutely. Cronyism, it comes from the Greek word kronios, meaning long time. So it means they're longtime friends of the president, the minister of public works or justice, or the mayor or whatever. They enrich their buddies when they get into office. There's this expression in Kenya, it might be known here as well. When my family gets into power, now it's our time to eat at the expense of the others. Well, this predatory system means, okay, we eat when we're in power, everyone else suffers. We might lose power, and then we will suffer, and that other family, that mafia group of some sort, will eat. We need to get rid of that system and have a system instead where politicians focus on the public good, which means the good of everyone in society, or another way to put it, the good of any member of the society chosen at random. That's what should matter.
That's a difficult thing to do, especially in Africa. For Ghana, I know, but I don't know for Nigeria. How is the system there like in terms of people going into power and saying that I have a family member and I think I should push him there at the expense of maybe somebody who is more qualified than my family member to be in that position?
I mean, it's the same problem in Nigeria. Nigeria is colloquially known for having like a very high level of corruption, and we're seeing this not only in government but also in the private sector, right? Because it becomes very difficult to get things done without knowing someone in power, without being friends with a politician, and the dynamic is also that look, when that happens, when you see that your business cannot thrive or cannot survive unless you know someone in power, so there's a lot of rent seeking going on. There's a lot of bribing going on. But you'd find that there's a lot more visibility when it comes to these issues, and a lot more people are speaking up. Over the last 10 years, there have been organizations and civil society organizations that have sprung up specifically to look into situations like procurement in government and point out when governments are being, biased in the distribution of public procurement. There are also a lot of civil society organizations, mostly run by young people, who are looking into promises made by the government and where those contracts are given out to friends and are never executed, and they're publishing this and bringing it to light and taking it to the media. So there's a lot more consciousness about these things, and these things have to change. I don't think it's surprising that it's young people who are starting up these initiatives and taking up this project and are pointing these things out and are demanding that these things have to change. We cannot wait because the cost of corruption is generational. It's not just me. It's my children and my children's children that are going to have to pay for it.
Before I go to Doc and wrap up with him, I have about 5 minutes more. There was a trade war, a very subtle trade war between Ghana and Nigeria. So there is a policy in the country that Nigerians or foreigners are not supposed to be engaged in the retail market. So when you go to the market, some petty things like selling of phones, doing tabletop market selling. But unfortunately, when you go to Tiptoe Lane, it's a place in Circle in Accra, you have a lot of Nigerians involved in that sector. Sometimes you see government agencies clamp down on them, but they come back. Whereas we are talking about Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the need to create a system where we can trade among ourselves, where do we draw the balance so that a country will not go too much or cross too much, or where they're not supposed to cross in terms of the retail market that exists in another country?
I would think that that's a policy.
You have 2 minutes for this.
Yeah, I think that policy should be addressed, right? Professor Ayite wrote very extensively about moving across and being able to trade, and it's not restricted to certain types of trade, right? The more you start restricting certain types of trade, it's a slippery slope. Then it leads from petty trading. It leads to, you cannot manufacture juice, so you cannot, bottle water. I think that it's something that we should not start. It should be addressed in Ghana, because it's not something that exists in Nigeria, and Ghanaians are free.
So Ghanaians are free to sell anything in Nigeria?
Absolutely.
Well, Doc, let me come to you. I was going to talk about Professor Ayite, so I just brought him. You're here for a lecture, memorial lecture. Talk to me just briefly about it and this book you're holding.
Well, this book is a great achievement. It's Professor Ayite's final book. It's a brilliant work. It was endorsed by Nobel Prize winners in economics. He was a very high-level scholar, and you can get it at zero price online. Look for Applied Economics for Africa, Ayite, and you could find it and download the whole book. He was a great scholar, and I'm here with my colleagues to encourage more young Ghanaians to learn about their own history, their own institutions. Professor Ayite stressed, markets are not a foreign thing. Africans have been trading for thousands of years before any Europeans or Arabs ever showed up, and use the strength of the African market system to make this country and this continent prosperous. And also, a very important message, not to discard what works locally in exchange for some foreign institution. Be proud of your history, be proud of your achievements, and be justifiably hopeful about the future. This is a message that he shared, and I hope more young Ghanaians, well, and old Ghanaians too, will benefit from Professor Ayite's wisdom and scholarship. He was
so
a
for
great
those of
friend.
you who do not know, Professor Ayite was a renowned economist. He died last year.
He died, he did.
Last year, and I'm sure he'll be proud wherever he is, seeing that this book is being held in honor of him. But what would be your last words to anybody watching Spotlight right now?
Wow. Well, a last word would be...
I would have loved for you to sing, but since you can't sing to save your life or dance, what would you say?
Sing or dance. Well, I would say this. Professor Ayite's work has shown why African indigenous institutions can be modernized. To be modernized doesn't mean being westernized or Asianized. It is about modern Africanization and using the strength of the African market system as the bridge to prosperity. So I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful, but it's justified hope. And the reason is that the resources for African prosperity are in Africans, not just Africa. It's not just gold and diamonds. It's Africans, the people, and their ability to create wealth.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tom Gordon Palmer. It's been a pleasure having you here on Spotlight. I also spoke with Olumayowa Okediran. He's the Director of Programs at Global Director of Programs, I beg your pardon, at Students for Liberty. Thank you so much for watching us as well. You spend an hour of your time with us here on Spotlight, and we cannot appreciate you less. My name is Adwoa Tenkoramaa, Domina, and on behalf of the entire team, we want to say a very big thank you to you for watching Spotlight. We'll come to you same time, same place next week. Do enjoy the rest of our programs. Mind your business and keep healthy. Bye-bye.